Good afternoon. I'm Kay Jacobson, the history coordinator of the Ramsey County Libraries, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the popular ongoing presidential series created by historian J.B. Andersen. We're continuing to look into the life of Abraham Lincoln, and today's talk is brought to you through the cooperation of OLLI, which is Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at the University of Minnesota, and the Ramsey County Libraries. JB is a lifelong historian, researcher, has taught at, I'm not exactly sure, JB, you'll have to clarify what you taught for over 25 years at the University of Minnesota. I know you've been associated with that, but I just know that so many people love hearing JB talk about um, presidents. So I'm going to be turning things over to JB. I'll let JB get up on screen there. Hi, JB. Okay, I'll turn it over to you.
First, happy Halloween to everyone. Interesting statistic that I looked up. It's estimated that the candy sales this year are at $4 billion. So that's a super happy Halloween for candy companies. But 4 billion, hey, that's like 1/30th of Elon Musk's wealth. I think he's around 120 billion. Anyway, have a great day tomorrow. See if hope you got enough candy to hand out. So some issues from last week I'm going to talk about first. There was a question about the Whig Party of the 1800s. It was founded in 1834, and whoops, sorry. And that's a misprint there. I used to always do misprints on slides for students and give them 5 extra points if they could find them. So anyhow, the Whig Party was 1834 to 1854, not 1954. And it was founded in opposition to Andrew Jackson, pictured here as president in the top photo or top painting. And the bottom is him at an older age. So the Whig Party did not like Andrew Jackson. They saw him as a tyrant, labeled him King Andrew. Political cartoons existed, such as what you see here, and he's dressed up like the King of England or the King of any country. Anti-Masonic Party joined the Whigs. Now, Jackson was a Mason, and he ran against John Quincy Adams. Now, the Masons are a secret society. This was a big issue in the 1828 election because John Quincy Adams was opposed to secret societies in a democracy, and Andrew Jackson was a Mason, member of a largely secret society. Whig's most famous members, pictured here is Henry Clay. Also Daniel Webster, very famous politician of this time period. William Seward, who served in Abraham Lincoln's cabinet, was a Whig. John Quincy Adams joined the Whig Party when it was created. And Abraham Lincoln, of course, was a member until the founding of the Republican Party in 1854. He joined up with the Republicans in 1856. William Henry Harrison was a Whig president. He was elected in 1840. He was the first log cabin president. This was a big campaign issue throughout the 1800s and even today, going from being relatively poor to being a person of great stature or wealth. So he was called the log cabin president. This was very famous for Lincoln, but it was not Lincoln who started that notion. And Lincoln didn't like it. He didn't like any references to his very poor background. William Henry Harrison died after 30 days in office. His vice president took over, John Tyler. He was a Whig, but he was placed in the vice presidency because the Whig Party wanted to be rid of him, and the vice president was somebody who could keep quiet, shut up. Well, all of a sudden, it backfires. Tyler becomes president for 3 years and 11 months and ended up vetoing much of the Whig legislation during his tenure in office. Zachary Taylor, pictured at the top here, was a general and elected president, and he died in office also. And Millard Fillmore was his vice president. Both of them were Whigs. So there was a total of 4 Whig presidents. Only 2 were elected to the office. 2 succeeded upon the death of the president. The party had 2 major factions. First was the conscience faction. These were mostly Northerners, and they were anti-slavery. And then they had what's called the Cottons faction. This is mostly Southerners, and they were pro-slavery. Whig Party platform, this was a question that was raised, what did they believe, raised last week. They wanted a national bank that was run by the U.S. government. The U.S. government had had a national bank for many, many years. It had been suspended, recreated, suspended again. The Whig Party wanted it opened again, and it gave the government much better control over the economy if they were able to have a national bank that was U.S. government run. Another Whig Party platform was ignore Supreme Court decisions. We talk about checks and balances between the executive branch, the congressional branch, and the Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court makes a decision, pretty difficult to override it. It requires a constitutional amendment. So it's, the power that the Supreme Court has as a result really, I think it's safe to say, outweighs the congressional and presidential branches. Limit presidential excesses was another item that they favored. They would hate today's presidency, which is called the imperial presidency, because the president has a great deal of power within the 3 branches of government. So they want to limit the president. They want the United States to be, by and large, congressional in nature, like the British Parliament was and is. They want high tariffs. A tariff is a tax on imports. So this was mostly a northern issue. The southern states were agricultural in nature. Northern states were manufacturing. By and large. So this was to protect US-made products. You place a tax on products coming in from foreign countries. States control their own lands. This is a states' rights issue. Federal government should keep out of what goes on within a state and how they use their land, etc. And relief during economic depressions. When there's bad economic times, the federal government should provide a good deal of relief. That's true today. Hurricanes most recently, they hit these southern states, hurricanes do, and do a lot of damage. And of course, these southern states are very big on states' rights and a lack of federal government, but more than willing to accept relief from the federal government. We also talked about some Minnesota books last week. On the left, John Dillinger Slept Here by Paul Maccabee, subtitled A Crook's Tour of Crime and Corruption in St. Paul. Lots of these very famous 1930s criminals lived in St. Paul and the northern suburbs, many of which were small towns at the time, especially Matamidi. And they'd live around White Bear Lake and Bald Eagle Lake. And why did they live here? In 1906, the chief of police in St. Paul, whose last name was O'Connor, set up a system. You criminals can come and live here, but you don't commit any crimes here, and we'll leave you alone. This is known as the O'Connor system, and it was in full-blown operation during these 1920 and especially 1930s criminals. So you can buy this book and drive around in White Bear Lake and Matamidi and visit places where these folks lived and ate and operated and so on. In the middle, St. Paul Murder and Mayhem is about cases in St. Paul. And then on the right, Alvin Karpus and the Barker Gang in Minnesota. The Barker family was from Matamidi. Ma Barker is famous, even though she was simply the mother, not a member of the gang, the Barker Gang. Alvin Karpus was a member of the Barker Gang. And Karpus got involved in a crime in St. Paul, something that it was agreed criminals would not do. They would be protected living in St. Paul by the police. But so this was a big deal. The crime, what he did is he kidnapped the son of the Hams Brewery family and drove him into Wisconsin and demanded a $100,000 ransom. He was captured thanks in large part to the work of other criminals who wanted to maintain the O'Connor system. I was going to college for 3 years in Kansas City, basically about 66 to 69. And Alvin Karpus was in Leavenworth Prison and was released. He had served something like 40 years for the Ham kidnapping. So there's a book about Alvin Karpus and the Barker Gang, which were local criminals. We also talked about street names, and there are posts that Kay Jacobson has made. Here's the book by Donald Epson, On the Street Where You Live, on the left. And the earlier copy of it, which I own, The Street Where You Live. I took a tour with Epson maybe 30 years ago. It was a bus tour sponsored by the Minnesota Historical Society. And he drove the bus around and commented on famous buildings and street names and where the names came from. It's a very interesting book. This was Babyface Nelson's favorite restaurant in the 1930s. It's in Matamidi at 959 Matamidi Avenue, which is Highway 244. And it's very near White Bear Lake there. Today, it's a beauty salon, the Juniper Street Salon. And the exterior has been redone, although just a few years ago, I would drive past here and it still looked like the Italian restaurant that was frequented by Babyface Nelson. One thing you'll learn about Nelson in the books about St. Paul is that he was a rare criminal in terms of education. He had a BA degree and spent a good deal of time in Matamidi being protected and safe from banks he'd robbed in other states. Now, back to Lincoln. We're going to talk about Lincoln's law career. First, an introduction. He was in Illinois, and that's where his law career was practiced virtually exclusively. It was mostly criminal and corporate law, mostly corporate in nature, and somewhat criminal in nature. He defended people accused of crimes. Let's take a look first at corporate cases. He was a big railroad guy, made a lot of money from railroads. We talked about that last week. His annual income was probably about $4 million a year in 2024 dollars, about $100,000 a year in the 1850s. And the big issue was railroads versus river traffic. So there was a fight between people who owned sailing ships and were delivering goods up and down the Mississippi River, and between railroads that wanted to build bridges across the river and along the river, taking up port sites that the river traffic wanted. Lincoln sided with the railroads. They were a giant customer of his. Railroads were building bridges at the time very low over water. Look at this. See, no boat can get under it. And of course, this is far less expensive. If you elevate a bridge, you have to have pillars underneath it to support it. That's a bigger expense. You have to have a slow 4-degree rise on the land coming up to the bridge, which is now elevated. Same on the opposite side. So this was a big issue that was argued between railroads and boat traffic. And of course, boat traffic won the day. Here you can see a bridge that's elevated so boats can sail under it. And of course, the height was regulated so that you could get larger boats underneath these bridges on the river traffic. And then you can see, you know, here's the bridge elevated. And here on the land, you now had to have a very slow 4-degree rise so the train could get up it. Look at the amount of land that had to be built up and the stretch of that land that had to be occupied by the railroad in order to get up to the bridge height and across the river. So a lot more work required on land, added tremendously to the cost of building a bridge, as did elevating the bridge. So higher bridges, here's a heavily pixelated drawing of a bridge that's elevated along the Mississippi River. Landowners became involved. Railroads would just simply, well, we're going to take up some of your land and make this huge elevated rail, and they just would walk in and start doing it, basically confiscating land from mostly farmers, and that was what occupied the land was occupied by the approaches to the bridge. So then landowners frequently would sue the railroad. Lincoln would defend them. Lincoln won 60% of the cases that he handled for railroads. Lincoln had a total of 175 cases that went to court that involved railroads. At a 60% win rate, he won 105 of those cases. He had a very good courtroom appearance and behavior. And this is where his nickname Honest Abe came from, because he was kind of revered in the court by all involved. Take a look at criminal cases that Lincoln had, and there were two major elements that really highlighted his career defending criminals. There was a testimony against a Lincoln client from an eyewitness to a crime, and he said he could see the crime being committed. That's why I'm a good witness to this. The reason I could see it is because there was a full moon and lots of light at night. So what did Lincoln do? He brought a book to court that showed phases of the moon, and the evening of the criminal case, it showed that there was no full moon, thereby negating the testimony of the man who claimed to be an eyewitness in the heavy light of a full moon. Second was a dying murder victim. And there was a bystander who went to the victim, and the victim identified his killer, pointed to the guy, pointed to another bystander. That's the guy that shot me. The bystander was identified as the defendant, identified the defendant as the murderer. Now, this is hearsay evidence. I'm telling you what someone else told me. This is not something that I witnessed personally. So the murder victim was dying. Hearsay evidence, not direct evidence. Hearsay evidence prohibits witnesses from testifying as to what other people told them. This ensures that the testimony is only what it was observed firsthand, not something that was spoken to you by another person who observed it. Interestingly enough, the prosecution objected to the testimony as hearsay, which indeed it was. Lincoln argued it was not hearsay, and the judge agreed with Lincoln and allowed the testimony. This is pretty amazing. Next up, Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. Lincoln was still interested in politics. He'd served in the Illinois legislature. And this act, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, that allowed or required that if a slave state enters the Union, then you also get to have a free state come in, and vice versa. Free state enters the Union, then a slave state enters. This would maintain the balance between slave states and free states. They'd always be equal in number. And Lincoln disliked this act. One thing too was, or that was the Missouri Compromise. I'm sorry, that the Missouri Compromise was one slave state, one free state. Kansas-Nebraska Act allowed people to vote on this. Do you want to be a free state or a slave state? There's going to be an election. Whoever wins, that determines if you're free or slave. Now, this does not mean that Lincoln supported the abolition of slavery. It simply means that he didn't want any new slave states. His support for these bills. Death of Henry Clay. This is a picture of Henry Clay here. Lived from 1777 to 1852, 75 years and 10 weeks. Big time Whig Party member. Died 2 years before the founding of the Republican Party in 1854. So he was in no position to make a choice about leaving the Whig Party and joining the Republican Party. But he's a major figure in U.S. history who was never a president. Lincoln did one of the eulogies at Clay's funeral, and he supported Clay. Clay wanted a slow emancipation of slavery. In other words, let's just slowly get rid of it, maybe state by state, county by county, maybe free 100,000 slaves every year until there are no longer any slaves, things like that. So both Lincoln and Clay saw people who wanted simply to end slavery as being political extremists. Peoria, Illinois speech, 1854 by Lincoln. Where the heck is Peoria? Well, here's Springfield. This is where Lincoln lived. Here's Peoria, and he was called to Peoria to make a speech. Peoria is famous. You don't hear this phrase so much anymore, but anytime there was a political debate or an issue over a law in Congress, people would say, "Will it play in Peoria?" And that it was a common phrase in political language. Springfield to Peoria, this distance here, 73 miles, about 2.5 days on horseback if Lincoln had ridden by horse. It's about 40 miles an hour by train. That'd be 2.3 hours from Springfield to Peoria. Three ideas in this 1854 speech that Lincoln emphasized. First, slavery is a major problem, at least within the United States. Many foreign countries had already outlawed slavery. Some had not, but Lincoln in this Peoria speech says, this is a major problem that's dividing the country. Oops. Secondly, it's an injustice to those that have to suffer under it. They work long hours, they're punished and whipped, they have no rights, can't vote, can't receive relief work, they are not considered to be citizens. So the hard labor, the punishment, etc. Lincoln in this speech says slavery is an injustice. Third, it's a major problem in U.S. foreign policy. And again, this is because many of the foreign countries in the world at this time outside the U.S. had abolished slavery within their territory, within their nation state, or even within the territories they had conquered. So, for instance, Britain had lots of land in Africa. So many foreign countries had abolished slavery. They look at the United States that still has slavery. So here's Lincoln making a speech in the 1850s. Lots of our friends and neighbors and enemies have abolished slavery. We haven't. They see that as a difficulty in negotiating with us, treaties, etc. This was Lincoln's re-entry into politics. He now was becoming interested in national office after having left the Illinois legislature. So Lincoln's crisis, he's a Whig, and he's opposed to the new Republican Party because it is abolitionist. I mean, it's 1856 platform said we want slavery abolished. Lincoln wanted a gradual end to it. Finally, though, in 1856, he did leave the Whig Party and join the Republican Party. The Whig Party was already pretty much a done for item by 1856. So Lincoln's theme was on the graphic, slow down, you move too fast. That's a Simon and Garfunkel tune. And that's Lincoln's position. Abolitionists want to move too fast. We need to do this slowly, gradually, and that way it won't hurt or harm people who own slaves all at once. So Lincoln becomes a Republican. 1856, he joins the Republican Party. The Whig Party has crumbled like blue cheese or a broken cookie. So another third party forms. Yep, these Republicans were a third party. You had the Whig Party and the Democrats Party, and now you got a third party, that's the Republicans. And they've come into existence as the Whigs are all falling apart. There's also a party known as the Know Nothing Party, which was opposed to immigration. In the 1850s, this was called nativism. In 2024, we often refer to it as build a wall or stop the immigration from the South. The amazing thing about the stop immigration movements, which have been in existence throughout much of our history, certainly at least 160, 180 years, there's been stop immigration movements, including the 1924 law that required a great deal of limited immigration and required that you meet certain obligations before you can become a citizen or even come into the U.S. So immigration in the 1920s, when the 1924 Act was passed, was based on population of the country you were coming from and how many people of your country were already in the U.S. Well, we didn't like Asians. We'd allow 100 people in from Japan every year, 100 people in from China every year. However, Europeans were a different story. Scandinavians made up a large proportion of the population of the United States, so we allowed immigrants from Scandinavian countries. Each country could bring in 100,000 people according to every year, according to this 1924 law. Southern European countries, such as Italy, could only do like 10,000 because their population was much smaller already within the United States. So this is still an issue. Are they, from the end of the Civil War till 1900, we couldn't get enough immigrants in here. Corporations were building themselves up like crazy and rapidly and needed lots of employees. So we were just allowing immigration to come in like crazy. Some people have proposed that instead of building this very expensive wall all along this northern border of Mexico, we should build it on the southern border of Mexico because that's a much shorter area and it wouldn't take as much money. And then we'd only have to control immigration out of Mexico. Whereas now we have lots of people walking or riding in some form from northern South America. Venezuela in particular has lots of immigrants entering illegally through Mexico. So anyway, build a shorter wall, less expensive. Illinois Republican Party Convention of 1856. It was held in Bloomington, Indiana. Here on the map, you can see Bloomington is right in the central part of the state. This is the Illinois Republican Party Convention. 61 miles from Lincoln's home in Springfield, so just a couple days trip on horseback and just a couple hours by train. The convention established or created the Republican Party of Illinois, the Illinois Republican Party. Here's their modern logo, GOP, with the O showing a silhouette of Abraham Lincoln in it. The Illinois Convention in 1856 also said the federal government has a right to control slavery in U.S. territories. So they can say what they want about slavery there. You don't have to wait until the territories become states and then have states' rights, which is what the slave states wanted. So let's take a closer look at the map. Look at all the territory in 1856. Everything in this light brown color. Here's Minnesota Territory, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Utah, Oregon, Washington, and this is a map of who won in the election. So all the blue states went for the Democratic candidate, and all the red states went for the Republican because their platform, a Republican platform of 1856, stated abolish slavery. Consequently, the South was opposed to it, as were a few northern states. So territories to be, this is the Italian Republican Party Convention. Slavery in territories can be controlled by the federal government. Third item, the convention established, supported the national platform of the Republican Party for the abolition of slavery. So that's an immediate end to slavery. And those were the three elements. Lincoln gave the final speech at this Illinois Republican Party convention of 1856. And he stated that preservation of the Union is really the most important item. And we're starting to see lots of conflict between the South and the North. And this could lead to trouble eventually, which of course it did. And this was his major concern during the Civil War. It was not the abolition of slavery. He frequently spoke about preservation of the Union. Eventually supported a constitutional amendment that would abolish slavery, but it was not passed until after his assassination. 1856 elections. Lincoln ran for a seat in the Illinois General Assembly and he won it, so he's back into local politics. But he soon resigned from it because he was looking forward to the 1858 election, which was for the U.S. Senate. And he said, even though I won this election, I'm resigning the position in the Illinois General Assembly because I wanted to devote my time to getting ready for the Senate election in 1858. Lincoln thought he had a pretty good chance of winning it. Now, in the 1856 presidential election, here are the totals. James Buchanan won the presidency, a Democrat, 1.8 million votes, 174 electoral votes. John C. Fremont was the Republican nominee, He got 1.3 million votes, 114 electoral. Millard Fillmore was a Whig, but he also was approved by the Know Nothing Party. He got 873,000 votes and 8 electoral votes. Lincoln supported the Republican candidate, John C. Fremont. This is John C. Fremont. He was a general in the Army and an explorer. And again, this was the first political party platform to call for the abolition of slavery. Fremont, as a kind of a side note here, was an explorer when he was in the Army, and he wintered over and explored the area around Pipestone, Minnesota, where the stone was quarried by Native Americans to make their peace pipes with. So, and it's a very interesting place. I've been there and visited, and it's well worth the long drive down there. You walk around and see the pipestone mining areas and lots of things that were made from the pipestone on display in a museum. So Pipestone National Monument. And Fremont explored this area in 1838. So that's 28 years before, or 18 years before he's running for president. Excuse me. Here is a rock at the Pipestone National Monument where the people who were in the expedition with Fremont wrote their names. And this is just a portion of the rock. When I was there, I took pictures of this rock, and I can't find them now. But amazingly, one of the names carved into the rock, which you can't see in this portion of the rock, was J.B. Andersen, but spelled S-O-N on the end. So a member of this expedition had pretty close to the same name as I have. Next thing we're going to discuss is the Dred Scott decision by the United States Supreme Court. Dred Scott was a slave versus Sanford, who was his owner. And gotta give me a second here. I need to find my cell phone so I can keep track of what time it is. Thank you. We got about half an hour of lecture time left. Dred Scott versus Sanford, a Supreme Court decision. First, the introduction. The issue was slavery, and Roger Taney was the Chief Justice. He wrote the majority opinion. This is Taney pictured here, and the decision was against Dred Scott, a slave who was suing for his freedom. And here are larger pictures of these two gentlemen, Taney, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and Dred Scott, who brought the suit against his owner. Let's take a look at Dred Scott arguments. He was owned by an Army doctor, and this Army doctor got stationed at Fort Snelling in Minnesota for 3 years. Slavery was not allowed in Minnesota territory. So Dred Scott says, hey, I lived there for 3 years. That makes me free, right? You know, maybe, maybe not. So on. Here is Fort Snelling after it was recreated here. I lived very near this site. I used to play there before these buildings existed back here. This round tower did exist at the time I was a youngster and playing in this area. Now the fort's been recreated. Here's this this roundhouse here. It was a beauty salon when I was a kid playing there. And the building was still looked exactly as it does in this photo here. You can see there's little slits in the round tower. You could have a cannon or a rifle pointing out. You could have soldiers up here. They would look in the land side here for anyone coming at them. And they could shoot in any direction from this round tower onto land. Now, at the back here, this is a cliff. You can just see part of the Minnesota or Mississippi River that come together right below here. It's a very tall cliff area. So it did not need the protection that a roundhouse would give because nobody could attack from that side. Very tall cliff. Here, when you, during the summer months, you can tour this recreated fort. And here's where the beauty salon was. This is the training field. During the summer months now, they have a few soldiers there that march around in the training field. And a kitchen is in here. They cook stuff for the whole soldiers that are stationed there. This is the commandant's house, a place where the commander of this fort lived. It's a very interesting place. During an attack, they opened the front door of it, had a cannon inside, and they'd shoot out through the front door at the Native Americans that got inside. The medical office is located in a part or a portion of this building here. The person that plays the medical doctor was a student of mine and an expert on 1800s medical practices. So Dred Scott's argument, he sued for his wife's freedom also. Here's a book about his wife, Mrs. Dred Scott, by Leah Vandervelte. You can look it up online or either order it or try to order it through a bookstore if you're interested. We lived in free territory for 3 years, remains the major argument. Okay, Roger, I guess I'd like to just take a second and say it was Dred Scott's owner and a relative of the owner who went to Dred Scott and said, we want you to sue. And they paid for the lawsuit. So they were people that were, even though they owned slaves, were opposed to it. And that's what brought this, the finances for this lawsuit. This is how the finances were made possible. So, Roger Tawney's arguments. African Americans are not citizens. They don't have any of the rights of citizenship. You know, you could say the same thing about women at this time. Women didn't get the right to vote till 1920. Native Americans have no right to sue. They're not citizens. They can't use the court system. They can't hold public meetings. They can't own or bear arms, as is guaranteed in the Constitution. There are state laws against them owning and bearing arms and holding public meetings where they might plan things that are negative for their owners. And they have no constitutional rights. So the number one argument used by Tawney against Dred Scott was, you're not a citizen. You have no rights, including a right to sue. The Constitution is a barrier between whites and blacks, according to Tawney's. Blacks are not citizens, whites are citizens, and whites get to live by the Constitution. Blacks do not. Blacks who are slaves, blacks who are freed, do not get to live by the Constitution. Third, state and local laws cannot change the Constitution. Constitution supports slavery. If there's a Minnesota state law that you can't have slavery there, the federal law takes precedence. The Constitution takes precedence, and it supports slavery. This is still an issue today, states' rights versus federal government. So Minnesota territorial laws do not count at this time that Dred Scott was living at Fort Snelling. Oh, number 4, he struck down, Tawney struck down the Missouri Compromise. That required that every time a free state enters the Union, a slave state must enter also, must be admitted to the Union. Tawney wanted all slave states. So he said, this Missouri Compromise law is also unconstitutional because it requires states, one state to be free, one to be slave, and you can't do that. Now, a lot of citizens had arguments about this case. First, slaves are property. Many citizens argued this. Can property sue an owner? No, it can't. Can a chair sue its owner for something? Of course not. A slave is like a chair. It's a piece of property. You sat on me wrong. Supreme Court vote. The vote was 7-2 in favor of turning down Scott's plea for freedom. 7 of the 9 justices voted in favor or against Dred Scott being free. 2 justices voted in favor of his case. You know, we just don't know the names of Supreme Court justices like we do presidents. And here's a list of these people that were on the court during this case. John A. Campbell, John Catrone, Peter V. Daniel, Robert C. Cryer, Samuel Nelson, Roger B. Tawney, the Chief Justice, and James M. Wayne. And those that supported Dred Scott's right to sue and be free, John McLean and Benjamin R. Curtis. The dissenters' argument, these 2 Supreme Court justices who voted for Dred Scott being freed. Benjamin R. Curtis, pictured on your left, wrote the dissent, 67 pages. This is a gigantic piece of work. And he was aided in the writing of that dissent by his fellow voter, John McLean, pictured on the right. 67-page dissent had 4 major items included in it. The first was that blacks are not citizens. This is a groundless and baseless argument. 5 of the 13 colonies allow blacks to vote. So how can you say blacks are not citizens when some states do indeed allow them to vote? Blacks are not citizens is an opinion, not a law. That was stated in the dissent argument. people being citizens is, do you live here? Were you born here? Those are requirements for citizenship. Consequently, that's really an opinion. It's not something that can be written into law, even though it has been. Third argument used by the two dissenters is they oppose the overturning of the Missouri Compromise. They wanted to maintain a balance between slave states and free states. And fourth, has three incidences that were never cited in the argument or the lawsuit. And that's the adoption of the Constitution. At the time it was adopted, there were no arguments raised about a ban on slavery in the Northwest Territory. This map shows the Northwest Territory, which existed at the time of this lawsuit. And there's nothing in the Constitution about this territory. And here, Dred Scott was in some of that territory, or in an area anyway, that was not yet controlled by the United States, even though we had a fort there. So the Constitution makes no argument about where he was at, so he can be free. Second item in number 4 is slave trade was banned in the United States in 1808. This was done by big slave owners. You know, they wanted to have kids they could sell. Well, their competition was more slaves coming from Africa and being imported into the United States. Stop the slave trade, we can make more money by producing slaves and selling them ourselves. Thomas Jefferson was a major supporter of this. So the slave trade was banned in the United States in 1808. We're now in the 1850s. So you can't import any slaves into the United States. Well, was Dred Scott, I mean, he was taken out of the US and then came back in. Was he imported back in? If so, you have no argument. He's free. Third item under number 4, slavery was banned north of 36 degrees 30 minutes, and this was part of the Missouri Compromise. Here's a line here. And any slavery above that line, except Missouri, Kentucky, and Virginia and Maryland, you know, which were already slave states. Anything north of that line in the western US must be free. So all of a sudden, you're not doing one slave, one free state. You're now saying everything south of this line, which is very little territory, can have slavery. Everything north of it cannot. And that's an argument that was being made by the dissenters. Lincoln's response to the Dred Scott case. The Supreme Court has reduced the humanity of slaves. We consider them not to be humans. They are indeed humans, Lincoln was saying. So this Supreme Court decision doesn't recognize the humanity of Black Africans. And he pointed out that this was one of the great evils of slavery. Got nothing to do with whether you're a citizen or not. It's an inhumane institution. Secondly, comment by Lincoln, strong belief in the legal system. He said there should be no resistance against this decision. It's a legal decision. I support it. Now, were these arguments by Lincoln an attempt to satisfy everyone? Or were they an attempt to alienate everyone? Slavery is inhuman. It's not, or there's no humanity in it. And a law is a law and should be supported. These are Lincoln's arguments. Is he alienating everyone? Is he satisfying everyone? Why did he say these things? Dred Scott decision overturned. The 13th and 14th Amendments to the United States Constitution overturned this Supreme Court decision. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment says you're a citizen of the United States if you were born here, regardless of race. Dred Scott decision is considered by historians, most of them, the vast majority, to be the worst Supreme Court decision in United States history. Lincoln. Back to politics, the 1858 United States Senate election from Illinois. An introduction. Lincoln wants to run for the U.S. Senate seat in Illinois. He's a candidate of the just 4-year-old Republican Party founded in 1854. This is now 1858. His opponent is the Democrat Stephen Douglas. Pictured here, this is a photograph of Douglas. Douglas had served 2 terms in the United States House from 1843 to 1847. He was elected in 1842 first. And in 1854, this is a big deal. Senators were not elected by the people. In 1854, state legislatures elected U.S. senators. This was part of the U.S. Constitution. Well, Douglas was the current senator, having been elected by the Illinois legislature. This was changed to people getting to vote for senators in 1914. So 1914, 16, and 18, you get 1/3 of the senators running every 2 years. They don't all run once every 6 years. So by 1918 election, all U.S. senators have now been elected by voters. This required an amendment to the Constitution, and it's the 17th Amendment that stated state legislatures no longer will elect senators. The people will. Well, the male people will. Lincoln-Douglas debates. There were 7 debates among Lincoln and Douglas, all of them in Illinois towns. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was the major item that was discussed in the debates. It was passed in 1854, and it allowed state voters to decide whether your state will be slave or free. Douglas sponsored the bill in the United States legislature, and he supported the bill. The state males over 20 or 21 or older get to decide if you're slave or free. Both areas in 1854 were territories, so it's called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And here you can see this is Nebraska territory, this is Kansas territory, and that's where the name comes from. So slavery was the main issue discussed in the debates between Douglas and Lincoln. The debate structure. one candidate would speak for 60 minutes. Then the second candidate would speak for 90 minutes. And then the first candidate would come back and speak for 30 minutes. So each candidate got 90 minutes of speaking time, 180 minutes. Hey, how would you like to be in that audience? But of course, this was considered major entertainment. This was an outing for people. There were no movies, no radio, no television, no nothing. There was an occasional dance in a barn someplace that you could go to, and there'd be music there and so on. But speeches were a big deal. And here you've got 180 minutes or 3 hours of listening to a couple of people speak. And the drawing here, the graphic, shows comparative height of the two men. Lincoln was 6'4", Douglas 5'4", a foot shorter than Lincoln. There's been psychological studies done on the height of people and what kind of attention they get. And they found corporate executives tend to be taller than average. Height makes a big difference to the stature, social stature of people. However, not in this case. Lincoln-Douglas debates, the slavery issue. Lincoln stated morality is the argument against slavery. There's really no political arguing about it. This is a horrible thing. It's a sin. So morality should be the major argument that's used against slavery. Douglas, he said, people should get to decide it, not morality. So you're going to have a slave state or a free state. This was known as popular sovereignty. The people get to vote as to whether or not their state is going to be free or be slave. Northerners accepted this. They liked this argument of Douglas's. Southerners rejected it. They wanted one slave state and one free state coming in at the same time, maintain the balance of slave and free states. And many of them wanted all new states to be slave states. No balance. Slavery issue, the Lecompton Constitution. This is in Kansas. It's a city. Here's Kansas City. It's very close to Kansas City, and it's Lecompton, Kansas. And it's where the Constitution for the new state of Kansas was being written. And Douglas opposed this Lecompton Constitution. It had three major features. Slave owning is legal in Kansas. In other words, we're going to be a slave state. Freed slaves have no rights. You can't vote, you can't bear arms, etc., etc. You have no constitutional rights, even if you're a freed slave. Third item in the Lecompton Constitution was the state legislature cannot free slaves. They cannot vote to free slaves or abolish slavery, end slavery, etc. They must have the permission of the owners of the slaves before they can free slaves. Well, this Constitution that was written in Lecompton, Kansas, was never ratified. So it was proposed, but it did not become the Constitution of Kansas. Douglas, Stephen Douglas, pictured here, gained a great deal of support in the eastern states for his opposition to this Lecompton Constitution, but was criticized by Republicans because he was supporting slavery outside of the state of Illinois, where he was a senator from. Slavery issue, 4 debate issues in this 1858 Senate election. Number 1, Lincoln was opposed to Douglas's support for slavery. Lincoln argued in the debates that it violated the constitutional statement that all men are created equal. It doesn't say all white men. It doesn't exclude black men. It says all men. Second item in the debates, Douglas supported the Freeport document. Let's take a look at it. States have a right to choose if slavery is permitted. That's the Freeport Doctrine. Here's a political cartoon. It's got Douglas here and a flute player here who's controlling the snakes. And the snakes all have names on them: Old Line, Whig, American, Democrat, Republican. He's dressed like a Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean person who, that's who would control the snakes in those days. You'd have a Muslim person, type person. And this political cartoon has Douglas in this Eastern Mediterranean Arab type clothing. Thirdly, he argued that Lincoln was an abolitionist. So he's accusing Lincoln of being something. We are hearing a great deal of this sort of argument today also. Douglas argued that Lincoln was not supportive of Supreme Court decisions. And I talked about this a little earlier today. Are there really any controls? Is there indeed equal control within the U.S. government? Is there a balance of power between the congressional, the executive, and the Supreme Court, or the court branch of government? Here's a SCOTUS is illegitimate. That's a modern day protester. Here's what all this means. SCOTUS is the Supreme Court of the United States. POTUS, you might see these sometimes in writings. POTUS is President of the United States. FLOTUS is the First Lady of the United States. And COTUS is the Congress of the United States. Lincoln-Douglas debates. There was a book here, the Lincoln-Douglas debates. You can order this book in any way, shape, or form that you wish to, online or from a bookstore. So the Lincoln-Douglas debates were printed in a book to support Lincoln during the 1860 presidential election. And Lincoln, moving back to politics, makes a first speech, and his super famous speech is this first speech that he makes in the 1858 Senate election by himself, is his House divided speech. If a house is divided against itself, that house cannot stand. From the New Testament, Mark chapter 3, verse 25, biblical quote by Lincoln. Every kingdom divided against itself is brought to desolation, and every city or house divided against itself will not stand. Matthew, New Testament, chapter 12, verse 25. So the issue of slavery and sectional divisiveness becomes a major issue here. This is the Mason-Dixon line here that divides the North and South, the famous dividing line between slave and free states. Sectional divisiveness, such as is pictured here. 1858 election results. Douglas wins in the Illinois legislature by a vote of 54 to 46. Again, popular votes did not start until 1914. So this is a big victory, eight percentage points here. Now, that's a good spot to stop. We're going to talk about next week. We will begin with Lincoln having bought a newspaper in Illinois, and we'll let you know about that. So let's quit this. And do we have any questions or
We do.
concerns?
We have a few questions. So, going back to the very beginning of today's lecture, looking at is there a backstory for how the Whig Party got its name?
Oh, I'll look it up. No,
Okay.
I
I'm
don't. I
assuming it's
don't know.
related
Yeah, of
to the
course.
British.
The wearing of a wig, that's a W-I-G, not a
Right.
W-H-I-G. So I doubt that's the origin of it, but
I
I'll,
would think it would be connected to the British Whig Party somehow, but
yeah, and I'll look up what that origin of that is. So you got the Whigs and the Liberals and the Labor Party in England. So that the name certainly grew from there, but where it came from in England, I don't know.
okay.
But
Also, while you're writing that down,
yeah,
someone was wondering about William Henry Harrison. What did he die from? Just brief.
William Henry Harrison died after a month in office. It's assumed he died of pneumonia. He gave a very lengthy inaugural address, and it was raining and cold, and he got super soaked. And of course, the word cold for coughing and having that disease was more common during the winter months when people are enclosed and spreading germs. But we didn't know about germ spreading at this time. So people called it a cold because it occurred in cold weather. And they assumed cold weather was the cause of diseases. There was also a major assumption that bad smells caused diseases. We didn't know about germs yet. So he spoke this inaugural address, which ran almost to 2 hours, and then died 30 days later as a result of the cold that people assumed he caught as a result of this lengthy speech in the rain. And a famous commentator of the time said, anybody who gives a 2 hour speech deserves to die. And then John Tyler became president and he was the first vice president to assume the presidency. And there was lots of debate about that. Congress said, no, we get to choose who the next president is. The vice president doesn't automatically get to go to the presidency. And finally, Congress passed a law that said the vice president will become president upon the death of the president. And Tyler was secure in the office then.
Okay, so now we're going to move on to the Dred Scott section with some questions. Since we're talking about citizenship with that, and did he have citizenship? When did Native Americans achieve citizenship?
Some people argue never. However, the 1924 law gave them citizenship. However, we have treaties with Native American nations all across the country. We have violated most of them. However, we've been beginning to enforce them. So Native Americans say our reservation territory is under our control, not the control of the US government of the state that we're in. Consequently, what did we see over the last 30 years? A rise of gambling on reservations, which was illegal according to many state laws. So, and it has become a multi-gazillion dollar business now. And so Native Americans have begun to gain more control over their own territory, at least. Now, in Duluth, Minnesota, they had tons of people going to a reservation about 20 miles or so outside of Duluth, because that reservation had gambling at it. And Duluth said, gee, we'd like to have those people in Duluth. So there was an old Sears store, multiple stories. And the city of Duluth said, we're going to give it to the Native Americans. So then they moved their gambling, their casino, into that territory, which was now part of their reservation, which is a multi-story building on a city block in downtown Duluth. So there's lots of arguments. Native Americans say no. Some U.S. laws say yes, but it came very late in our history.
Okay. And someone was wondering, does the definition of Black from back in the Dred Scott time differ from then to now?
Yes. If you were, sorry, that's my phone ringing. If you were if you were 1/32 Black, you were considered to be a Black person, and you would have to live in slavery as a result. I could have picked that up and slammed it down again, I guess, but anyway, sorry. So they would keep track of, Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings had 6 children. The term used was mulatto. They're half Black, half white. The next white and mulatto, and you get a quadroon, and that's a person that's 1/4 Black. And you have to get down to being 1/64 Black before you're a white person with citizenship rights. That was during slavery. Now, slavery is a social creation. The people that did all the genetic research and identified chromosomes say there is no genetic markers for race. The races are all the same. Race is a social construction. It's not a biological one. The difference between me and a person in Asia is 0. We look different. Maybe we may have a different shade to us, different eye structure, etc. But basically, the genetics are the same. And there's nothing that separates racial groups genetically, according to geneticists. Anyway, there are people that argue against that. So 1/64 Black, and you could become a citizen. Now you're born in the US, you're a citizen. Makes no difference what your race is. And of course, you see people on campus. I'd see people from Africa. They are Black. American blacks are really brown. There's been so much intermixing between the races. And anyhow, end of story.
Okay, in terms of the Constitution that didn't get ratified in Kansas, um, there ended up being what's termed Bleeding Kansas that happened after that, where there was the um, fighting erupting between pro-slavery and free.
Yeah. You had Quantrill's Raiders were a Missouri group, and that was a slave state. A member of Quantrill's Raiders were the James brothers, Jesse James and his brothers, who later became famous criminals. They would
So
march into Kansas. They marched into Lawrence, Kansas, lined up all the white males and shot them.
did
And
Lincoln have any opinion on what was going on because of this?
who?
The person was wondering, did Lincoln have any opinion on?
Oh, no, I don't. I've never seen anything on Lincoln supporting Quantrill's Raiders or the John Brown group. John Brown was anti-slavery and lived in Kansas, and he started fighting Quantrill's Raiders and
Okay.
causing trouble in Missouri. And then he went all the way, he took over a U.S. fort and was arrested and hung for treason. Also, uh, yeah, that whole Kansas thing and their constitution and whether they'd be free or slave was a whole separate battleground. It was really pre-Civil War. Some people say some of those battles between Kansas and Missouri were the first battles of the Civil War. Some people say John Brown's taking over of a United States fort was the first battle of the Civil War. So,
Okay, couple more ones, see if we can get through them quick here. The
okay,
map shows Minnesota as Minnesota Territory and Northwest Territory. They're wondering, were we not also part of the Dakota Territory at one time?
I don't know. Uh,
So,
yeah,
because I'm
I
thinking, didn't Minnesota become a state before, and then Dakota Territory got separated off because it
yeah,
had been part of the Northwest?
yeah.
Is how I'm feeling.
I think Dakota Territory included maybe about 2/3 of Minnesota, and
Okay,
Northwest Territory included about a third of it.
okay,
And then it was made into a separate state that had, parts of each. So,
okay. We can look into that for maybe next week.
yeah.
Was the United States the last country to legally abolish slavery? Otherwise, what countries still enslaved people besides the US?
Uh, there is still slavery. It is illegal. I think it's illegal everywhere, but slaves exist.
But yeah, in terms of we weren't the last country to legally abolish it, were we? I don't
I
think.
I would guess not. I would guess there were South American countries that maintained it longer than we did. I'm pretty certain of that, but I can,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, well, we had a number of people pointing out things like there's a Dred Scott exhibit down in Missouri because that's where the case took place. You can see different things we talked about, like Dred Scott's room at Fort Snelling you can visit if you go to the space. So yeah, lots of great places to go around and check and see these things that we're talking about. But it is now 2 o'clock, and we are going to thank Grayson Simmons, our contact at Life OLLI, who's been recording all of this. This will probably be up on the website by the end of the week. We thank JB. Go
Can I
ahead.
add one quick comment?
Mhm.
That's Dred Scott is buried in St. Louis, Missouri. A tombstone was placed on his grave 1 year ago. Yeah,
Okay.
it's very large, and that's something that can be visited also. Thanks.
Okay, so thanks everyone. We will see you next week when we're back with JB.